For 6 years, Luna Aveline Frostmere sat in the same chair every evening. Third chair from the head of the royal table to the Alpha King's right. Never late, never absent, never drawing attention to herself. The servants expected her there. The council expected her there. The royal household expected her there. Eventually, her presence became so reliable that nobody consciously noticed it anymore, including her husband, Alpha King Cassian Thornvale. The strange thing was that their marriage had not started badly. Quite the opposite. The first 2 years had been happy. They shared meals, walked through the palace gardens together, stayed awake late into the night, discussing plans for the kingdom. Back then, conversation came naturally. So did laughter. Then life happened. Kingdoms demanded attention. Responsibilities multiplied. Meetings stretched longer. Crises appeared more frequently. And little by little, their relationship shifted. Not through conflict, through neglect, the dangerous kind. The kind that arrived so gradually, nobody noticed it happening. At first, Cassian missed a few dinners, then several. Eventually, entire weeks passed, where they exchanged little more than polite greetings. Aveline always understood. At least, that's what everyone assumed. The king was busy. The kingdom came first. That was the price of leadership. So she adapted, like she always did. She attended dinners alone when necessary, managed palace affairs quietly, supported charitable programs, resolved disputes between noble families, handled dozens of responsibilities nobody thought to document. The work simply got done, which made it easy to overlook. Months became years. The distance grew, and somehow the absence of connection became normal. One evening, during a formal banquet, Cassian arrived nearly an hour late. The council immediately rose. Servants hurried into position. Conversations resumed the moment he sat down. Across the table, Aveline watched quietly. No complaint, no disappointment, just silence. Halfway through dinner, one advisor asked the king a question about border negotiations. Cassian answered. Another advisor raised concerns about trade routes. The discussion continued. For nearly 40 minutes, not once did anyone speak to Aveline. Not because they disliked her, not because they intended to exclude her. They simply forgot. By the end of the meal, she had spoken exactly 3 sentences. Nobody noticed, not even Cassian. After dinner, the king stood immediately. "I have another meeting." Aveline smiled. "Of course." He nodded distractedly, then left. The entire interaction lasted less than 10 seconds. A servant standing nearby watched the exchange with growing concern. Later that night, another servant quietly approached Aveline. "My Luna." Aveline looked up from her book. "Yes?" The younger woman hesitated, then asked softly, "Are you happy?" For a brief moment, something flickered across Aveline's face, gone almost instantly. Then she smiled, warm, polite, practiced. "I'm fine." The servant accepted the answer, just as everyone else always did. Unfortunately, sometimes the most dangerous words in a marriage are not arguments. They're, "I'm fine." And Aveline had started saying them far too often. At first, nobody noticed the change. That was the problem. Aveline didn't disappear all at once. She faded gradually, quietly, the way sunlight leaves a room at dusk, 1 degree at a time, until suddenly, darkness is all that's left. She stopped attending unnecessary celebrations. Then she stopped hosting social gatherings in the palace. When invitations arrived from noble families, she politely declined, always with a smile, always with an excuse. "No, thank you. I have other obligations. Perhaps another time." People accepted her answers without question. After all, the Luna had always been responsible. If she said she was busy, she was busy. No one looked deeper. No one asked why. Not even Cassian. Especially not Cassian. The Alpha King remained consumed by royal duties, trade negotiations, military reports, territorial disputes. Every day brought another crisis demanding his attention. And every day, Aveline became a little quieter. During council meetings, she stopped offering suggestions. At first, nobody minded. The council continued functioning. Discussions continued. Decisions were made. The kingdom survived. Weeks passed before anyone realized something strange. Many of the ideas they once relied upon had disappeared. The practical solutions, the compromises, the observations that prevented small problems from becoming large ones. Those contributions had always come from Aveline. Now they didn't. Yet somehow, nobody connected the dots. Not immediately. One evening, during a diplomatic dinner, the silence became impossible to ignore. Foreign dignitaries filled the banquet hall. The atmosphere remained lively. Conversation flowed freely. Laughter echoed from every corner. At the center of it all sat the Luna, elegant, composed, invisible. By the end of the evening, Aveline had spoken exactly 4 sentences. A servant counted, not intentionally. The number simply seemed remarkable. The following week, she spoke even less. Still, nobody commented. Still, nobody asked. Because silence is easy to miss when you're not listening. One afternoon, Aveline sat alone in the palace gardens. A notebook rested in her lap. For nearly an hour, she wrote quietly, lists, plans, observations, thoughts she no longer shared aloud. When she finished, she stared across the gardens for a long time, as though making a decision. Later that evening, she and Cassian attended dinner together, a rare occurrence these days. The meal lasted nearly an hour. During that hour, they exchanged only 5 sentences, 3 from him, 2 from her. Neither seemed to notice. After dinner, Cassian stood. "I'll be working late." Aveline nodded. Of course. The familiar answer, the familiar routine, the familiar distance. The king left the room. Aveline remained seated, watching the empty doorway. For several moments, she didn't move. Then something shifted inside her. Not anger, not heartbreak. Acceptance, the kind that arrives after trying for too long. That night, long after the palace fell asleep, Aveline entered her private chambers. She opened a trunk, removed several travel bags, and began packing, not impulsively, not emotionally, deliberately, carefully, as though she'd been preparing for this moment far longer than anyone realized. Because deep down, Aveline had finally understood something painful. You cannot make people notice your presence, and eventually, you stop waiting for them to try. Aveline left on a Tuesday morning. No arguments preceded it. No dramatic confrontation. No shattered glass. No tearful goodbye. The palace woke, expecting an ordinary day. By sunset, its Luna was gone. Only a handful of servants saw her leave. She wore a simple traveling cloak instead of royal colors. No guards accompanied her. No royal procession followed. Just a carriage, waiting quietly beyond the palace gates. A few trusted staff members helped load her belongings. None tried to stop her. Because unlike everyone else in the palace, they had noticed. They had seen the loneliness, the silence, the gradual disappearance happening in plain sight. One elderly housekeeper hugged her tightly. "Are you certain, my Luna?" Aveline smiled, the same gentle smile she always wore, but this time it looked different, lighter. "I am." The woman blinked back tears, then stepped aside, and Aveline left. Inside the palace, life continued. The royal council assembled. Military reports arrived. Messengers entered and exited constantly. The kingdom remained busy, as kingdoms always are. Before departing, Aveline left 2 letters, one addressed to the council, one addressed to Cassian. The council's letter was practical, professional. She explained her departure and formally resigned from several royal responsibilities. No blame, no accusations, just information. Cassian's letter was much shorter. A single sentence, nothing more. I hope one day you notice the difference. When the letter reached his office later that afternoon, the king barely glanced at it. Not because he didn't care, because he was distracted. 3 urgent meetings demanded attention. 2 border disputes required immediate review. A trade agreement needed his signature. The letter joined a stack of documents waiting for later. Later never came. Days passed, then weeks. The palace continued functioning, at least on the surface. Aveline's departure created no immediate crisis. That was the cruel irony. She never managed the highly visible responsibilities, the dramatic ones. Her work existed elsewhere, in conversations, relationships, quiet interventions, the emotional architecture holding daily life together. The kind of contributions people only recognize once they disappear. Unfortunately, nobody had reached that point yet, not even Cassian. 3 weeks later, the king walked through the palace corridor after a particularly exhausting council session. He rubbed his eyes, trying to ease a headache. A passing thought suddenly surfaced. Random, unimportant, at least it seemed that way. He frowned, then turned toward a nearby servant. "Has anyone seen Aveline recently?" The young woman froze, completely froze. For a moment, she simply stared at him, as though she wasn't sure she heard correctly. Cassian noticed immediately. "What?" The servant lowered her eyes. "My king." A long pause followed. Then she answered carefully. "The Luna left 23 days ago." Silence. Complete silence. Cassian blinked. "What?" The servant swallowed. "The Luna left the palace 23 days ago." The words felt unreal. Impossible. 23 days? Surely not. Cassian stared at her, waiting for clarification, for explanation, for something that made sense. None came, because the servant wasn't mistaken, and for the first time, a terrible realization began forming. He couldn't remember their last real conversation. Not vaguely, not approximately, at all. And suddenly, Aveline's letter didn't seem quite so unimportant anymore. That evening, Cassian attended dinner as usual. At least he tried to. The routine was familiar. The royal dining hall glowed with candlelight. Servants moved quietly between tables. Council members discussed trade reports and border security. Everything appeared normal, yet something felt wrong. The feeling followed him from the moment he entered the room. A quiet discomfort he couldn't explain. Cassian took his seat at the head of the table. A servant poured his wine. Another delivered the evening meal. Conversation continued around him. Then his eyes drifted to the chair beside him and stopped. 3rd chair from the head of the table. To his right, empty. The sight shouldn't have mattered. 1 empty chair, nothing more. Yet suddenly it was all he could see. For 6 years, Aveline had occupied that seat. Every evening, every banquet, every celebration, every ordinary meal. Always there, always present. And now, nothing. Cassian stared at the chair longer than necessary. A council member noticed. "My king?" The question pulled him back. "What?" The advisor glanced toward the empty seat, then quickly looked away. Nothing else was said. The conversation resumed, but Cassian struggled to focus. His attention kept returning to the same place, the same absence, the same empty chair. Halfway through dinner, another realization struck. He couldn't remember the last meal they shared. Not clearly, not specifically. The memory should have existed. Instead, everything blurred together. Meetings, reports, schedules, days becoming weeks, weeks becoming months. When had they stopped talking? When had silence become normal? The questions lingered long after dinner ended. Over the next several days, Cassian began noticing other things. Small things, the kind previously hidden by routine. The palace gardens looked neglected. Several flower beds sat unattended. When he asked the head gardener why, the man seemed surprised. The Luna usually oversees the seasonal planning. Cassian frowned. She does? The gardener blinked. She did. The correction landed awkwardly. A day later, a charitable program requested emergency funding. Apparently, donations had stalled. The director explained the situation apologetically. The Luna usually coordinated these efforts. Again, the same phrase. A few days after that, two noble families arrived at court, arguing over an inheritance dispute. The disagreement had already escalated. Voices raised, accusations exchanged. When Cassian asked why mediation hadn't occurred sooner, one advisor hesitated, then answered, "The Luna handled these matters." Again, "The Luna handled that. The Luna usually solved this." The Luna would know. Every problem seemed connected to the same person. The same absence. The same empty chair. The pattern became impossible to ignore. One evening, Cassian entered the dining hall alone. As usual, the servants prepared dinner. The council gathered. The chair remained empty. For several moments, he simply stared at it. Then something uncomfortable settled inside him. Not grief, not yet. Awareness, the beginning of it. Because for the first time, Cassian wasn't looking at a chair. He was looking at evidence. Evidence of how much he had overlooked. And the more he noticed the empty space beside him, the more he feared what else he had failed to see. The empty chair followed Cassian everywhere. Not physically, mentally. Every dinner, every council meeting, every walk through the palace. Soon, he stopped seeing it as furniture. It had become a question. One he couldn't stop asking. What else had Aveline been doing that nobody noticed? The answer arrived faster than expected. The palace gardens deteriorated first. Flower displays, once admired throughout the kingdom, began looking neglected. Seasonal plantings were delayed. Several restoration projects stalled completely. When Cassian summoned the head gardener, the man appeared uncomfortable. "My king, we've been trying." "Trying what?" The gardener hesitated. "The Luna managed all long-term planning." Cassian frowned. "Personally?" The man nodded. "Every season." The king stared. He had never known that. Not once in 6 years had he asked. The realization sat heavily in his chest. Then came the charitable programs. Several community initiatives suddenly requested emergency assistance. Food distribution networks struggled. Funding shortages appeared. Volunteer participation declined. Again, every explanation sounded the same. The Luna coordinated that. Cassian heard the phrase so often it became impossible to ignore. One afternoon, a council member arrived, carrying several overdue reports. Normally, Aveline reviewed them before they reached the king. This time, mistakes covered nearly every page. Missing information, unresolved disputes, incomplete recommendations. Cassian rubbed his temples. "Who handled this before?" The council member blinked. "The Luna." Of course, always the Luna. Every answer led back to her. Days later, two noble families arrived at court. Their disagreement had escalated into a public feud. Accusations flew across the council chamber. Voices rose. Threats followed. The situation consumed nearly 3 hours. Afterward, a senior advisor sighed. Aveline would have resolved this in a week. Cassian looked up. What do you mean? The advisor seemed surprised by the question. The Luna regularly met with both families. The king stared. She did. Yes. A pause followed. She prevented conflicts before they became official disputes. Silence filled the room. Because once again, Cassian realized he knew almost nothing about the work happening directly beside him. Not because it was hidden, because he never looked. The pattern continued. Every department, every project, every community initiative. Aveline's influence appeared everywhere. Quiet, consistent, invisible, until now. One evening, Cassian stood alone in the palace corridor. A servant passed, carrying a stack of documents. Another hurried toward the council chamber. Life continued. The kingdom survived. Yet somehow, everything felt less organized, less connected, as though small pieces were missing from every corner of palace life. Pieces nobody appreciated until they vanished. The king exhaled slowly, then asked a question he should have asked years ago. What exactly did my Luna do? The advisor standing nearby laughed softly. Not because the question was funny, because it was heartbreaking. My king, he said gently. A better question might be... He paused, then looked directly at Cassian. What didn't she do? The answer lingered long after the conversation ended. That night, unable to sleep, Cassian wandered through a quiet wing of the palace. Eventually, he stopped before a familiar door, a door he hadn't opened in years. Aveline's study. The room remained untouched since her departure, silent, waiting. And for the first time, Cassian found himself wanting answers, real answers, because somewhere inside that room existed a version of his wife he had never bothered to know. He reached for the handle and pushed the door open. Aveline's study looked exactly as she left it. Neat, organized, quiet, the scent of old. Paper lingered in the air. Moonlight filtered through tall windows, casting silver patterns across the floor. Cassian stepped inside slowly. For a moment, he simply stood there, taking everything in. The room felt strangely personal, more personal than any place in the palace. Because unlike the throne room or council chamber, this space belonged entirely to Aveline. And he realized, with growing discomfort, that he had never spent more than a few minutes here, not once in 6 years. Bookshelves lined the walls, maps covered one table, stacks of reports occupied another. Every surface reflected careful attention, careful planning, careful thought, the same qualities Aveline brought to everything she touched. Cassian moved deeper into the room. His fingers brushed over documents, community projects, charitable initiatives, agricultural reports, page after page of work. The sheer volume stunned him. How had one person managed so much? And how had he never noticed? Then he found the journals, 6 leather-bound volumes arranged neatly on a shelf, one for each year of their marriage. At first he assumed they were diaries. They weren't. They were records, detailed notes documenting projects, meetings, and observations, the practical work of daily life. Cassian opened the first volume, then another. Hours passed. He barely noticed. The deeper he read, the more uncomfortable he became, because Aveline had quietly shaped countless aspects of the kingdom. Programs he thought appeared naturally, partnerships he assumed others arranged, solutions he credited to luck. Again and again, he discovered her fingerprints, everywhere. Then he noticed something else. Scattered between the reports were occasional personal entries, short, simple, honest, never dramatic, which somehow made them hurt more. Cassian looked exhausted today. I wish he would rest. A few pages later, we passed each other 3 times this week and never had a conversation. Then another. He missed dinner again tonight. I saved his favorite dessert anyway. Cassian stared at the sentence. His chest tightened unexpectedly. The entries continued. Not angry, not resentful, just lonely, painfully lonely. One page stopped him completely. Sometimes I wonder if becoming easy to rely on also makes you easy to overlook. The words lingered, because he already knew the answer. Hours later, he reached the final journal. The last entry sat near the end, written 3 days before Aveline left. Cassian read it once, then again, then a third time. I don't think he would notice if my chair stayed empty forever. The room became unbearably quiet. Cassian closed the journal immediately, as though the act might somehow lessen the impact. It didn't, because the sentence was true. That was the worst part. Not cruel, not exaggerated, true. For nearly a month, he hadn't noticed she was gone. The realization settled heavily over him, and suddenly, every dinner came rushing back. The empty chair, the silence beside him, the space where she used to sit. For the first time, Cassian understood why he couldn't stop looking at it. It wasn't a chair anymore. It was a reminder of conversations never had, of moments ignored, of a woman who spent years beside him while he looked everywhere else. And now, he couldn't stop wondering where she was. The first real news about Aveline arrived 3 months later. Cassian was reviewing trade reports when a messenger entered the council chamber. The young wolf bowed. "My king." Cassian looked up. "What is it?" The messenger handed him a sealed document, a report from the coastal province. Normally, such reports would have gone directly to the appropriate department. This one didn't, because a single name appeared on the first page. Aveline Frostmere. Cassian's pulse quickened unexpectedly. He opened the report immediately, then frowned. The document contained nothing alarming, quite the opposite. Community programs had expanded. Local businesses reported increased profits. Several neglected villages were undergoing restoration. Volunteer participation had nearly doubled, and attached to nearly every success was the same name, Aveline. The report painted a clear picture. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't struggling. She wasn't spending her days mourning a failed marriage. She was building something. Again, just as she always had. Only this time, people noticed. Cassian read the report twice, then a third time. Finally, he looked toward his advisor. "Prepare a carriage." The older wolf blinked. "For where?" Cassian folded the report carefully. "The coast." 2 days later, he arrived. The province stretched along rugged cliffs overlooking the sea. Fishing villages dotted the shoreline. Ships crowded newly repaired docks. The entire region felt alive, busy, growing, and everywhere he looked, people seemed optimistic. The change was remarkable. A local official greeted him upon arrival. After the formal introductions, Cassian asked the only question that mattered. "Where is she?" The official smiled immediately, as though the answer was obvious. "At the harbor." Of course. The king followed directions through the town. As he approached the waterfront, the sound of construction filled the air. Workers moved supplies. Merchants discussed logistics. Families gathered near recently completed buildings. The harbor looked transformed. Then he saw her. Aveline stood near a collection of blueprints spread across a wooden table. Several local leaders surrounded her, listening carefully. As she spoke, Cassian stopped walking. For a moment, he simply watched. The sight felt strangely familiar. Not because she'd changed, because she hadn't. Aveline was doing exactly what she always did, solving problems, helping people, building communities. The difference was that everyone here seemed to recognize it, respect it, value it. One fisherman approached and thanked her personally. A shop owner followed moments later, then a village elder. The admiration was genuine, earned, and impossible to miss. Eventually, Aveline looked up. Their eyes met across the harbor. Surprise flickered across her face, gone almost instantly. Then she smiled politely, the kind smile offered to an old acquaintance. Not a husband, not a partner, just someone from a previous chapter of life. The realization struck harder than Cassian expected, because for the first time, he truly saw it. Aveline wasn't waiting for him. She wasn't looking back. She had already moved forward, and somehow, that hurt more than anger ever could. Still, he walked toward her, because after everything he had learned, there were things he needed to say. The harbor bustled with activity around them. Workers carried lumber, ships unloaded cargo, merchants negotiated prices. Life continued. Yet for Cassian, everything seemed distant, because after 3 months of searching, questioning, and regretting, he was finally standing in front of Aveline. And suddenly, he wasn't sure where to begin. Aveline dismissed the local leaders politely. "I'll review the final plans tomorrow." The group nodded and moved away. Soon, only the two of them remained. For a moment, neither spoke. The sea breeze moved strands of hair across Aveline's face. She looked healthy, relaxed, lighter. The difference was impossible to miss. Finally, Cassian broke the silence. "You left?" The words sounded foolish the moment they escaped. Aveline smiled faintly. "Yes." The answer carried no bitterness, no anger, just fact. Cassian exhaled. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question lingered between them. Aveline studied him quietly, then asked, "When would I have?" Silence. Complete silence. Because he had no answer. The question exposed everything. The missed dinners. The unfinished conversations. The endless meetings. The distance he allowed to grow year after year. When would she have told him? During one of the meals he skipped? During one of the weeks they barely spoke? During one of the countless moments he chose something else first? The truth hurt, because opportunities had existed. He simply never noticed them. Aveline folded her hands calmly. "I didn't leave because of one argument." Cassian nodded slowly. "I know. I didn't leave because of one mistake." Again, he nodded, because that part was obvious now. People rarely walk away because of a single bad day. They leave because of years. Years of disappointment. Years of loneliness. Years of feeling unseen. Aveline looked toward the harbor, then back at him. "I left because I became invisible." The sentence landed harder than any accusation. Harder than anger. Harder than blame. Because it was true. Painfully true. Cassian lowered his gaze. For months, he had searched for an explanation. A dramatic event. A final argument. A specific moment where everything broke. There wasn't one. The damage came from neglect. Small moments, missed opportunities, conversations that never happened. Until eventually, the absence of connection became its own answer. "I'm sorry." The words felt inadequate, tiny compared to the weight of what he'd realized. Yet they were honest. Aveline smiled gently. "I know." That somehow made it worse. Because she wasn't seeking revenge. She wasn't waiting for him to suffer. She had already made peace with the situation. Already healed. Already moved forward. Cassian looked around the harbor, at the people greeting her warmly, at the projects she supervised, at the life she built. Then he finally understood something devastating. Aveline hadn't left the palace to find herself. She already knew who she was. She left because she wanted to be somewhere that noticed. Somewhere she mattered. And standing there, watching her thrive without him, Cassian realized he wasn't the center of her future anymore. He was simply part of her past. The next morning, Cassian and Aveline walked along the harbor one final time. The conversation was easier now, not because the past hurt less, because the truth no longer needed to be avoided. For years, they had lived beside one another while slowly drifting apart. Now, for the first time in a long while, they were being honest. Unfortunately, honesty did not change reality. The sea rolled gently against the docks. Workers greeted Aveline as they passed. Each smile, each nod, each casual conversation reminded Cassian of something painful. She belonged here, not because she ruled, not because she held a title, because she was seen, valued, appreciated, the thing she had quietly stopped feeling at the palace. Eventually, they reached the end of the pier. The morning sunlight shimmered across the water. Cassian stopped walking. There was one question he still needed to ask. One final hope he had not fully abandoned. Would you ever come back? Aveline looked at him for a long moment. The answer appeared in her eyes before she spoke. No, not cruel, not angry, certain. And somehow that certainty felt familiar, because once upon a time, she had offered that same certainty to him. The difference was that he hadn't recognized its value until it disappeared. Cassian nodded slowly. The answer hurt, but it also felt deserved. Some mistakes could be forgiven, not undone. Aveline stepped closer. There was a time when I wanted you to notice me. Her voice remained gentle, calm, honest. I waited a long time. Cassian closed his eyes briefly, because he knew. Now he knew. Far too late. When he opened them again, Aveline smiled. A genuine smile. The kind he hadn't seen in years. I hope you're happy, Cassian. The words carried no resentment, only kindness. That somehow made saying goodbye harder. A few minutes later, he left, alone. The journey back to the capital felt longer than the journey there. Not because of distance, because of understanding. The palace looked exactly the same when he returned. The same corridors, the same council chamber, the same dining hall. Everything unchanged, except him. That evening, dinner was served as usual. Council members discussed kingdom affairs. Servants moved quietly through the hall. The routine continued. Cassian took his seat. Then his eyes shifted automatically to the chair beside him, third chair from the head of the table, to his right, empty. The sight no longer surprised him. It never would again. Years passed. The kingdom prospered. The coastal province prospered. Life moved forward for everyone involved, yet the chair remained. No replacement, Luna occupied it. No one removed it. No one suggested changing the arrangement. And every evening, Cassian saw it. The empty chair, the quiet reminder, the lesson he carried for the rest of his life. Because Aveline had been right, he eventually noticed the difference, just much later than he should have. And by then, the woman who once sat beside him had already built a life where she was valued, where she was appreciated, where she was seen. While the Alpha King spent every dinner facing the space that taught him a truth many people learn too late. Presence is easy to overlook until it becomes absence. And sometimes, by the time you finally notice what is missing, the person you lost has already learned how to live without you.